But I see what you're saying, Sarah, about that these tech companies are very reactive. Because I think when a bunch of stuff started coming out about Twitter and China and Russia, they started doing things like suddenly labeling state-run media accounts on Twitter and just giving you a little pop-up that tells you if you try to click on a China Daily link or something, it'll tell you that this is a the state-affiliated media. And I remember there being a bunch of like an outcry from a bunch of Chinese reporters who were actually working for Xinhua or China Daily or People's Daily and kind of trying to keep that on the down low in their Twitter profile. So it was kind of like what you were talking about with that guy in Israel with China Radio International, where they were essentially on their profiles trying to hide the fact that they were working for state-run media, and they would just be like, oh, their profiles would look like they're just, random China experts or, just a person who likes to be on Twitter and is Chinese. And then they started getting these like state-affiliated media flags on their profiles. So if you looked at it, it would just say China state-affiliated media, and people got really mad.
It actually has worked really well. I mean, I think in terms of that affiliation, there was one study that found that actually engagement with tweets from Chinese affiliated accounts went down by like a third after this labeling started. I do think that's why you're also seeing more kind of covert and sneaky ways of trying to get content on social media. I mean, the fellow in Israel, to his credit, his accounts, his own accounts are labeled. It was more when he was like making primetime television appearances in Israel that actually I think it was an ethical gap on the part of the local Israeli media that didn't make clear in the labeling like who he was. And they were actually pretty heavily criticized by some observers in Israel. But I think you definitely do see, I mean, I don't know the exact time correlation between, this very clear effort at transparency and, an effort on the other hand on the part of, propaganda authorities and whoever runs the disinformation campaigns in China, deploying more of those type of covert efforts. There are still a lot of accounts that aren't labeled. In some cases, they're not officially labeled by Twitter, but they do explain who they are. So that's like a gap. But then there was one account, for example, I think it was in Kenya, that had a decent following, several tens of thousands, and post these videos of Africans talking about how great China is for the region. And it's pretty clear that it's like somehow linked to CRI, but it's definitely not labeled as such. So you do see like that attempt to, as you said, to kind of to obfuscate those ties.
Well, so give us, like for the average American, give us a sense of like why they should care, how this affects them, what the risk is.
I think it's different from country to country. I think for average Americans, just knowing what Chinese state media are, and that when you see that China Watch, it's not in the New York Times anymore, but now it's in Time Magazine or USA Today, just kind of knowing that, that this is content, having some media literacy of like what these Chinese state outlets are. I mean, Americans are for the most part pretty skeptical of it. I think the trickier thing is, again, like when you have Chinese state-linked accounts trying to address like domestic political issues and polarization in the U.S. But honestly, I do think it is maybe more on apps if you're talking about in the U.S. context, in terms of WeChat for those who speak Chinese. And TikTok's a little trickier because ByteDance has been a bit more responsive. But like there's constantly just more information coming out that lends to concerns over a lack of transparency and what data is accessed and what potentially could content be manipulated. So I think just trying to push for more transparency from the company. And I think if we're going a legislative route, legislation that would require some level of regular third-party audits. Because when we really found in like so many countries in terms of the response, is that in this space, transparency really worked. Exposés just really work to raise awareness and blunt the impact because people need to be careful.
Yeah, I mean, you said in the report that these efforts are becoming more sophisticated and aggressive and harder to detect. Is that because of some of the pushback? Like how are they kind of evolving this?
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you look at public opinion towards China and Xi Jinping, when they first did the push to really expand state media and influence narratives globally, that was like in 2009 to 2015. Public opinion about China improved quite a bit. That's partly correlation to that, and partly because of other factors. But more recently, they're really having a much harder time, and in a lot of cases, it's because the CCP's own actions undermine its narrative. So that can be domestic issues like mass detention of Uyghurs or completely gutting autonomy and political rights in Hong Kong. But it's also internationally. I mean, they can talk all they want about win-win and we don't interfere in internal affairs. But then when, fishermen in the Philippines are being affected by takeovers of the South China Sea, that's on national television there, right? So people are going to have a much more negative view. When, local journalists and commentators are exposing on Twitter or writing articles about the fact that they got a call from the Chinese embassy to tell them to take down content, they're like, what? In a lot of places, they're like, what? No, you can't tell me what to do. And they expose it. And then there's this real indignation. In France, the government even called in the local Chinese ambassador to officially rebuke him for doing that against a French commentator. So I think it's like really their actions are undermining their own narratives. And so that's why then, so many people are just skeptical of anything they know that's coming from the Chinese government or Chinese state media. Some cases because they're just skeptical of state media anyway. There's a local history of authoritarianism or communism. But if it's from China, even more so. So then they have to get much trickier in terms of either forcing people's hands and using stronger economic leverage to get people to suppress content, or hiding the actual state-linked origins of content that's reaching local audiences.